Hello there. Welcome to the Humanising Machine Intelligence interview series from the Australian National University. I'm Stephen Mann, and with me today, Annette Zimmermann, postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University. Annette, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about the ethics of artificial intelligence,
Right.
but first, you've got a background in political philosophy. So what's political about artificial intelligence?
Right, so I think that's a question that is on many people's minds. There's a lot of buzz about ethical AI at the moment, so people kind of think, well, it looks like the main problems are going to be problems of moral philosophy and perhaps of epistemology, right, metaphysics. So other areas of philosophy look to be more intimately related to the kinds of issues that we see crop up in machine learning and AI. Now, I think given that designing algorithms and designing machine learning systems always means making particular choices, we immediately see the political significance of that. So just to give you an example, think about an algorithm that is being used to score people for a credit scoring system. And so then that means you have to define as a developer what it means to be creditworthy. Similarly, for algorithmic decision-making in criminal justice or in law enforcement, you might want to define what does it mean to label somebody as a high-risk individual. And so this is where problems very quickly arise because it's politically contested who is risky, who is dangerous, who is worthy of receiving credit. So all of these questions require making a conscious decision how we measure exactly these features. Now, that also entails that the developers themselves have a huge amount of responsibility. And so that often gets forgotten because a lot of debate right now is about the responsibility of governments, the responsibilities of citizens to educate themselves about what particular technology entails and how it works. And yes, that's really important, but it's also really important to think about the provision side of technology. So what choices and what responsibilities do we find on the side of corporations and developers themselves?
So this ties in with a forthcoming paper of yours on,
Right.
correct me if this is wrong, the political significance of choice in the design process.
Right. So that paper is called "The Algorithmic is Political," which perhaps is quite descriptive. So in that paper, I just want to stress that we have to be skeptical of this myth of inscrutability that we often find in the debate. So a lot of people think about machine learning systems and they think, oh, there's a lot of uncertainty there. There's a lot of opacity, and that's true, right? So in some forms of machine learning, we actually need to build in a certain amount of opacity in order for that learning process to work. So uncertainty in that sense can be really productive. That obviously also means that we can not always explain what exactly goes on. So how did a particular decision outcome actually come about? And so that leads a lot of people to think, well, of course, if I have this amount of inexplainability in my machine learning system, how can I say that developers and corporations made conscious choices, right? How do we actually locate that choice in that machine learning system at large? And so to that I would say, yes, it's true that there is defined and constrained uncertainty, but it's not true that we therefore cannot say anything, right? So often we know quite a lot of things about why and how particular decisions occur. And that's in particular true for so-called narrow AI. So these kinds of algorithmic systems that we currently use. So we're not talking about AI in this highly sophisticated robot sense. So machine learning researchers would call that artificial general intelligence, where you basically have an autonomous agent that is just artificial, but otherwise quite human-like. And we don't really have that. What's on our horizon right now is narrow and domain-specific algorithmic decision-making and machine learning. So we define a particular task, and for that defined task, we deploy machine learning to solve it somehow. And so there we actually know, okay, what sort of data are we using? What sorts of classifiers do we come up with? So decision rules that the machine learning system operates on. And so all of these things can help us think more about the responsibility that we want to allocate to those who develop and provide this technology.
And the HMI project as well focuses on narrow rather than general artificial intelligence.
Right.
What are the sort of justifications for that? Do you think that there's no philosophical problems with general artificial intelligence, or just that the more pressing ones are those for domain-specific applications?
So I think that's well put. I think both are very important philosophical questions. I do think that the kinds of philosophical questions that arise might be slightly different. And certainly with narrow AI, we see this immediate political and moral urgency. So just thinking about algorithmic decision-making systems that have been shown to lead to gender and racial bias, for instance. For instance, in the criminal justice application, you might have heard about the Compass algorithm, which, as investigative journalists at ProPublica showed, just had a really disproportionate distribution of error rates for Black and white defendants. Now we look at that and we see that's an immediately apparent problem that conflicts with many values that we have in contemporary democratic states. And so I think that's why when we find this urgency, it makes sense to focus our philosophical investigation on that, in addition to the technological discourse that is going on in that area. Now, with artificial general intelligence, we might want to ask questions like, what is consciousness? What does it mean to be a person? Should we extend categories like moral and legal personhood to those entities? But again, I think we really need to remember that the questions there are just quite far ahead. I think there's a lot of openness in the public perception right now to the idea that we're just at the cusp of developing these incredibly autonomous and sophisticated artificial agents. And so I think this is where researchers, including philosophers, can do a lot to debunk these notions.
So just to go back to something that you mentioned earlier with regard to opacity.
Right.
You said that it's not too much of a problem, or that possibly it's not as big of a problem as people sometimes think. What kinds of philosophical analyses can we give of a system when we don't know how that system is doing what it's doing?
Right. So I think understanding that uncertainty is present would ground a presumption in favor of adopting an ex-ante perspective on a lot of moral and political problems. So to give you one example, if you want to understand what algorithmic injustice is, for instance, you might think, let's look at all of the cases of, let's say, discriminatory harm that have already occurred when I use particular machine learning systems to address particular tasks. And so I could then say, well, from my point in time, what sort of distribution of harm do I find? What's unfair or unjust about that? Which important moral interests does it maybe infringe upon? But then you might think, well, given that all of these systems are inherently predictive and probabilistic, we also need to look into the future, right? So there we lack certainty. We might be operating under ignorance, so we have a pretty clear picture about which options are on the table. We just don't know which probabilities are attached to those possible decision outcomes. Or we might have a more encompassing form of uncertainty, or we don't even know which options are out there, right? Like, what might our system come up with? And so an ex-ante perspective, philosophically speaking, on those questions would entail thinking about whether things like pure risk can be morally wrongful, right? So there is a debate in legal philosophy, for instance, but also in normative decision theory right now, that tries to cash out whether a risk can be wrong, even if it never eventuates. And so I'm very interested in assessing exactly these kinds of ex-ante questions and building them into a theory of algorithmic injustice.
Just to be clear on this technical term for the lay audience who may not be au fait with the philosophical jargon, ex-ante here means something to do with something before an event occurs.
Right, so we're looking forward into the future, and we're assessing those risks of harm that may or may not occur from our point in time.
And there's a possibility that simply imposing risk upon somebody could be wrong, even if that risk never occurs. So, for example, poor health and safety procedures in place at a workplace could be bad, even if nobody ever gets harmed. Is that right?
Right, so that's a perfect example. In fact, I can think of another one, which is also not from the algorithmic context. So there we can see that these kinds of problems are actually much bigger philosophical questions that aren't necessarily confined to the algorithmic domain. But think about things like a stop and search policy, right? So you might think, well, even if one particular person never gets stopped and searched, but they're still bearing this risk that, at some point they might. And let's assume that that person knows that people like them are more likely to be mistreated when they do get stopped and searched. And they're more likely to just be profiled. So, stopped more often. So under that set of circumstances, that person might think, well, I know I can basically go out all the time and do what I want, but I want to avoid being treated in this way. So I'm going to take certain options that I normally have off the table, whereas other people who don't belong to that set of persons, won't feel constrained in this particular sense. And so this is why legal philosophers argue that pure risks can be wrong, because they infringe on people's moral interest in autonomy, right? So they make certain options very risky or very unattractive. And that in itself constitutes something that is wrongful, even though it doesn't materialize into an actual material disadvantage or harm.
Even being under the imposition of risk means that you might change your behavior, and so that can cause disproportionate harms.
Exactly. So I think it's very important to take that idea and to think about how we can apply that to the algorithmic context. So one of my research projects right now is called Algorithmic Injustice Beyond Discriminatory Harm. And it's exactly this idea that discriminatory harm is a huge aspect of algorithmic injustice and a very important one. But even if actual harm doesn't occur, we might still be operating under an unjust set of circumstances.
Okay, so from that phrase, algorithmic injustice beyond discriminatory harm, it reminds me of the old philosopher's truism. There's a lot to unpack there.
Right.
So just focusing on discriminatory harm, that's a specific category. That's actual harms that, in fact, have occurred and impacted somebody.
Right. So discriminatory harm is something that we can assess from an ex post perspective, so a perspective where we look back. And so that's why the legal system can assess this kind of category, right? So that's why you can bring forward a claim. This person has been discriminated against. Here are the facts of the case. These are the disadvantages that have gone along with that process. And so again, I think that really captures a whole set of cases that are morally objectionable about algorithmic decision making. So I don't want to say that that's unimportant. In fact, I think it's one of the most important aspects. And so we see that across domain, not only in criminal justice and policing, but also in other kinds of allocation mechanisms. So when we use automated decision making to allocate schools to children or welfare services, or again for credit lending. So in all of these domains, we find that discriminatory harm. And we might still ask, well, is the solution then that algorithmic systems are fair just if we fix discrimination? And this is an important question to ask because a lot of people would answer yes. So a lot of people, in my experience, in technology policy would say yes. A lot of computer scientists would say that yes, which is why they're really focused on fixing exactly that dimension. And as a philosopher, I want to say, well, let's think about what kind of question we're asking, what we define as the problem in the first place, before we articulate what it means to solve this problem, right? So it might turn out that the problem is actually much bigger than discriminatory harm. And so risk, as I said before, is one aspect of that. But also the reverse is true. So you might imagine a situation where you have non-discriminatory harm that actually occurs, right? So remember before, the risk case was a case where harm may or may not occur, right? But it's discriminatory somehow, so that risk is kind of unevenly or disproportionately distributed. But the flip side is also really worrying. And again, that isn't captured in the discriminatory harm paradigm, that definition of algorithmic injustice. And so what I mean here is, if you think about a case where I just have a kind of condition of background injustice in society, and then I impose equal harms on each member of that population, the way in which that harm will play out will be dramatically different, precisely because I have other features of society that influence whether people actually have access to the rights that they have in that society.
Yeah, imposing the same kinds of disadvantages on people. Right. Some people are simply able to overcome those disadvantages due to other features that they already had.
Exactly.
Another piece of work that you've done that gained quite a lot of popularity, as I understand, was AI Ethics 7 Traps, which was going through some of the misconceptions that people sometimes have in issues relating to this topic. We've talked about a few of them, and we perhaps don't have time to go through all 7, but if you could just indicate one or two that you take to be the most significant misconceptions.
Right. So I think one big problem in the public debate on AI ethics right now is that people think, well, actually, what we need is kind of a checklist, right? So a lot of people outside of philosophy aren't actually aware that ethics is a kind of subdiscipline of philosophy. I think their conception of ethics is something more like, this is basically a compliance mechanism or a quality control measure. The problem there, of course, is that ethical reflection is never a one-off process, right? So we want to continue to question and reason critically while we deploy new technology and while we witness technological innovation. The checklist model is radically different in comparison, right? So that checklist model says, let's let developers make design choices. Let's let corporations make choices. Let's let governments acquire this technology and use it in their public institutions to automate decision processes that were formerly, done by humans, and then let citizens deal with that. And then maybe at some point we should ask, but is it ethical? The problem is actually that process of critical reasoning needs to kick in much, much earlier. So both on the side of developers and corporations, but also on the sides of citizens, right? So whenever you have a government making decisions about, using things like facial recognition technology, I think citizens need to also engage in this critical reflection. Do we actually, as a collective, as a society, want to automate a particular process? And so we see exactly this phenomenon more and more now, especially last year, where citizens and activists have called on governments to just stop deploying particular forms of machine learning. So San Francisco is a good example where facial recognition technology was banned. Previously, the police force was using that. And the concern was just, actually, as a group, we don't want this. We don't want to automate this particular process. We want people to go through the difficult process of justifying and reasoning about whether a particular decision should be made. So even if you then have a human and therefore fallible decision maker, we want to put ourselves through this ethical justification process. And so I think that's an important thing to remember, which is why I wanted to cast doubt on this checklist idea of AI ethics.
And we've heard examples of employees of corporations, say Microsoft and I think also Google, speaking out against the policies of those companies, the contracts that those companies enter into, that is seen as being unethical.
Right. So a big application that is gaining traction right now and critical attention, obviously, is the use of machine learning systems in military domains. And so that's where a lot of employees have come forward and have articulated an ethical discomfort with that.
So employees for technology corporations have this sense of what it takes to be an ethical application. Right. And this speaks to a sort of broader methodological issue that you've also talked about, which is regarding the philosophical discourse about these issues and the discourse within computer science. Right. I guess there's a worry that those two groups of people are going to fail to communicate with each other.
Right. So I think that's a genuine worry that we have to address exactly in this moment. So while it is true that a lot of computer scientists have done incredibly useful work on ethical problems in relation to machine learning systems, there is often just a conceptual and normative translation gap. So for instance, I think a lot of computer science literature on this topic assumes that there is one concept of fairness, right? Or maybe that the concept of fairness or justice is quite straightforward to define. And I can see why that happens, right? I think most people have a kind of rough conception of what they mean when they say, oh, this is fair or this is just. And I think that's fine, right? So I don't think we all need to be trained philosophers. But I think the contribution that philosophers can have in this discourse, and that's perhaps so far an under-acknowledged contribution, is to really cash out what the different meanings of things like fairness and justice might be. So does it mean just treating all like cases alike, so adhering to a kind of notion of procedural fairness? Or is it maybe a thicker conception, a conception of more substantive fairness that also requires redistributing certain benefits and burdens, or maybe correcting for outcomes that have already occurred? And so that's something that is increasingly being welcomed by computer science, but I would still say we're still at the infancy of this kind of connection here. I think maybe the biggest challenge right now in terms of overcoming these translation problems is that computer science, when it is focused on things like algorithmic fairness, is always automatically focused on coming up with a metric for what would be fair. And what's missing in that kind of account is an account of where our kind of algorithmic decision-making model ends and where society begins. So obviously, many computer scientists are keenly aware of the fact that societal factors and algorithmic factors will always interact. Now, the wrong conclusion to draw from that would be to say, oh, well, we're just going to focus on the technological questions here, and all of the society stuff we can't even begin to address. Let's not even get into that. But if you know that there's an interdependency between those two domains, it's really hard to make that argumentative move. So I think we need to think carefully about how we want to build models and whether those models should try to abstract from society, and if so, how they can abstract in a way that still rings true to us. And so that's a concern that we see quite often when people talk about things like trustworthy AI. The question is, what does it take to trust an artificial agent or a machine learning system? Now, typically when we think about trust, we think, well, I will trust you if I'm reasonably confident that you won't betray me. Maybe you've made a promise to me or something. And I trust that you will actually not do certain things because of that promise. Now, the question is, how do we guarantee this in a machine learning context, right? Especially when the decision-making structure on which machine learning systems are built has to necessarily abstract from individual relationships and individual people and build a generalizable model that is able to learn from historical data. The big problem here is that often those abstractions rely on counterfactual reasoning. And the question is, well, in some circumstances, what is the appropriate counterfactual, right? So if I take you, what is the total opposite of you? Which feature of you should I pick out to construct the perfect foil to you? So immediately we have a lot of uncertainty here, conceptually and normatively speaking. And so that makes it quite hard to trust in a highly abstract system. Now, computer scientists are going to say to that, well, but if we abstract really well and if we really think hard about how this reasoning process should look like, we can address that worry. And I think as a philosopher, I suppose I would again caution to rush to a solution. So maybe it's always going to be that case that the boundaries between the technological domain and the societal domain are necessarily fuzzy and to some degree uncertain. What we need to do is just to question exactly that kind of fuzzy boundary. We need doubt and philosophical expertise to question the ethical questions that arise there.
Are you hopeful for a future of collaboration between philosophers and computer scientists?
I'm quite optimistic. So this is maybe an unpopular view, but I personally have recently attended a number of fascinating computer science conferences. There's a big movement in computer science right now called FATML, so Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency in Machine Learning. Many of my colleagues at Princeton are involved in that. So I think there's a real openness for interdisciplinary engagement right now. I think the challenge is just that both disciplines need to actually quite quickly acquire skills that allow them to talk to each other. So that means that philosophers need to understand things like statistics, and they need to understand what machine learning even is, how does it work. Whereas computer scientists, I think, have to become more open to the idea that there can be such a thing as normative uncertainty, and that there can be many different plausible accounts of what it means to be fair, or what it means to be accountable, or what it means to be transparent.
Well, on that optimistic note, I think that's just about all we've got time for. Annette Zimmermann, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time.